Those notes in the back, if you didn't get those, there's still some back there. As I printed you off the notes starting at verse 8, but we've gone past that, so we'll kind of just wanted to just print you off something right in the middle. So we'll be actually starting tonight at verse 13, but let me remind you and kind of catch you up if you weren't here the first week. Once again, we're walking through the book of Romans. Romans is a book that Paul wrote. He's writing it to the Christians of Rome. This is not a church like most of Paul's letters, even though there would have been kind of house churches and groups of Christians. But he's writing this to basically all of the Christians of Rome, and he's writing this because he wants to go to Rome. He wants to come to them and kind of not only just be there, see them, he wants to witness there. He wants to be a part of that. That's kind of where we let off last week. But his initial long-range plan is to go to Rome, the capital of the world, right? If Caesar's there, he wants to be there. He wants to minister there, but use that as a base as he would continue north up into Europe and kind of around the world. Now, we know he never gets to go that far. He eventually gets killed by Nero in Rome when he gets there. But he's writing this kind of as a letter saying, here, I want to come. I've been wanting to come. He's gone through all 3 missionary journeys in the books of Acts. So he's kind of been all over the kind of world, kind of the northern Israel world, kind of that area, Turkey, all that. And so now he wants to move into Rome. So he's writing this, and as he's writing this, he's in Corinth. He's writing this in the late 50s, 57, 58 AD, writing this letter of talking about this. And so he's kind of, in the beginning, he is telling the Christians of Rome kind of who he is. He's kind of giving a little kind of biographical information, who he is. But if you remember, we kind of jumped right in, starting in verse 8, kind of this idea of what he wants to do and why he wants to go to Rome. And then tonight, we're going to see that switch in verse 16. And really, verse 16 of chapter 1, almost all the way through chapter 15 is really one thought. He's going to be talking about the gospel, and he's going to be defining the gospel. And that's why Romans is a great book. That's why we are doing it. That's why it's so important, because you have to remember these Christians who are both Jewish and who are non-Jewish, but when they know of Paul, they don't know much of Paul's conversion. They don't know the new Paul. They know the old Paul. And so he kind of has to give them some information to say, hey, I'm Paul. I want to come to you. I'm not Paul the persecutor. I'm not Paul the police. I'm not Paul that's going to come and hurt you. I'm the Paul who has been radically changed. And this is the gospel that I have been preaching. This is the gospel that Jesus has declared to me. So that's kind of the book of Romans. He's really saying, I want to come to you, but he gives us this definition of the whole gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's kind of the book in a nutshell. And so we'll spend the whole semester, kind of the rest of the year, breaking that apart. But into verse, kind of on your page, verse 8, we talked about this. He's told them that he thinks about them. He wants to be there. He wants to serve them. He wants to come to them. But notice, so you kind of where we left off, just to remind you, in verse 12, it says that I want to come that we may mutually be encouraged. So Paul, when we think about Paul who's wrote most of the New Testament. He's a great spiritual leader. It would be very easy for Paul to go to Rome and to set up an official church in Rome and to say, okay, this is great. Get out of my way. Let me lead, right? Paul has started so many churches. He is an apostle. He has seen the resurrected Jesus Christ. And so he has kind of the ultimate resume to do it. But Paul is saying, I don't want to come in and undo anything that you've done. I don't want to come in and redo anything that you've done. I want to come alongside you. I want to know you. I want to get to know you. I want to grow you. But also, I want to encourage you, but I also want you to encourage me. So it's kind of not a takeover by Paul, but he understands that this is a ministry and this is what he's been praying to do, so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. And then verse 13, which I think is the second page in your handout, we kind of left off on 12, but we're continuing that thought, right? This is why I want to come, verse 13. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. And so we can see here that unaware is, I don't want you to be ignorant. I don't want you to not understand. I want you to really know I've intended to come to you. He's tried multiple times to come to Rome, but he's been stopped. And we don't, if you read back through Acts and you read through the missionary journeys, we don't get particulars in why he was stopped. We don't know if there was not a timing way, if there was not a boat going that way, or if God was just shutting doors and God needed him in another direction, or if the Spirit was just telling him, no, not at that moment. We don't know exactly what prevented Paul in going to Rome. But if you read through Acts and you read through Corinthians, when he's giving kind of his resume, I've been imprisoned, I've been beaten, I've been stoned twice, I've almost been killed. Those are some great reasons, right? I mean, he's been kind of preoccupied in the few short years that he's been doing ministry. But he's gone, but notice that he wants to go to reap some harvest among you. And we see this a lot. We see this word a whole lot. We're going to see it a lot in the month of September in our new sermon series that you'll get to hear about this Sunday. I'm super excited. But the word harvest is the word karpos. And the word karpos is really talking about fruit, right? It's talking about fruit and vegetables. It's a farming term. It's a gardening term. And so he says, when I want to reap some harvest, it's not just I want to pick some fruit. It's not saying that I just want to, go to Lane's and get some peaches and come home and eat peaches. When it talks about I want to harvest, and when we see this word, when Jesus uses this word, when we're talking about evangelism, this word harvest means for profit or for gain. You're not just picking peaches at Lane and going home and eat them. That would not be the word karpos. The word karpos is if you went to Lane and you picked every peach that you possibly could, and then you would sell them and you would create a profit. There's something grand after the work. And so when we think of this in an evangelistic term, it's not just, hey, I want to go and share the gospel. I just don't want to go and pick peaches. I want to go and pick peaches and see the fruit of the labor, right? So it's the harvest. I want to see the profit. God will bring the profit. And as I said, we'll talk more about that in September. It's a great word, a great analogy. In order that I may reap some harvest, I may share the gospel among you as well as the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to the Greeks and the barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are also in Rome. Notice that word under obligation. This is not kind of a personal reason. It means under compulsion. And the best way to explain this word is to kind of give you a picture. If I was to give you $100, and you needed $100, and you said, "Hey, Sean, I'll pay you back. I give you $100." You would be under compulsion. You'd be indebted to me to pay back that $100. But that's not the word that this is. The illustration that goes with this under compulsion is if I gave Joe $100 because Gary asked for $100 and I wasn't going to see Joe, so I wasn't going to see Gary, so I gave Joe $100, and now Joe is indebted not only to me, but he's also indebted to Gary to get that done. He has not fulfilled his calling until he delivers Gary the $100. That's the word there, under obligation, that's used. That's the illustration there. So when Paul says, I'm under compulsion, it's painting a picture that God has given me something. God has given me the gospel. And it's not just for me, it's not just for me to do, but I'm under compulsion that I need to take the gospel and I need to deliver it. I need to give it to the people that God intended. And so he said, I'm under compulsion to who? To the Greeks and to the barbarians. Now, remember, he's writing to Rome, right? There's not Greeks there, there's Romans there, right? But you have the Greeks and you have the barbarians. And he says both to the wise and the foolish. He's using these two categories to understand. The Greek and the wise, the word Greek is Helen, and the wise is the word sophos. So we looked at that word earlier in Colossians, Sophia. That's the word wisdom in Greek. But basically talking about the wise, the educated, the normal people. Back in those days, Alexander the Great has conquered the world. If you're going back to Daniel, right, the third, before the Romans take over. And during that short time where Alexander reigned, there was a thing called Hellenization. And so they came and said, it would be great if the world spoke one language. And they made that Greek. And so because that language, because that empire ruled and that language spread, if you could not speak Greek, you were instantly looked at as if you were dumb, if you were uneducated, you were lowly. Greek was the common language, right? For us, if you traveled the world, a lot of times American English is kind of that language, right? But if you've ever gone somewhere and you go somewhere and you're like, hey, and you expect them to speak English and they're just like, and you're kind of like, what, you don't know English? And they're like, what? Don't you know this? Right? We expect everybody to know English, but they don't. When I went to South Africa, you think everybody would know English. That's a lie. They don't even care to learn it. And so there was a lot of people, and now all of a sudden you're drawing pictures and, using gestures and, doing the potty dance, looking for a bathroom. You kind of, you're looking for all this. But here he says, well, I'm under obligation to deliver the gospel to the Greeks, to those who are smart, those who are wise, but also to the barbarians and the foolish. The word barbarians in the Greek is barbaros. And you will not see that word until the Greek culture. The Greeks defined that word. They gave them the word barbaros. And the reason it comes from is that when the Greeks came upon somebody who did not speak Greek, they said it would be as if they were going bar, 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 bar. Kind of that, you remember Charlie Brown, the teacher? Wah, 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 wah. You remember that? That's the same thing. So because the Greeks, when they would come in, they would go to a store, they would go to a market, and somebody would come up and say, how much is this? But they might say it in Phoenician, they might say it in Latin, whatever, right? They could say it in whatever language, but if it wasn't Greek, all the Grecians around would start going bar, 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 and drown them out to embarrass them, to get them to leave, because they were not important. And so Greeks and barbarians, barbaros, and the foolish. They kind of make each other to go. They're uncultured, uncouth. So here, Paul is writing and says, I'm under obligation. God has given me something, and I need to give it to the Greeks and the wise and the barbarians, which is anybody who's not Greek, and for anybody who's foolish. I need to deliver the $100 bill that God gave me to everybody. This is basically what he's saying. And so because of that, we get verse 16. So we've kind of said, I want to come. I've been praying for you. I want to evangelize. I want to be a partner with you. I want to encourage you. I need you to encourage me. I want you to kind of be the base of my fourth missionary journey that he never went on, right? I want you to do this. And then verse 16, notice the word for or because, right? So everything that he just said, because I want to come to Rome. I want to come where the emperor's at. I want to come to the most powerful city in the whole wide world because I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the $100 bill God gave me. I want to come to the most powerful place. Now, if you remember 2 weeks ago, and I know it's really hard, I talked about a guy named Claudius, Emperor Claudius. Emperor Claudius was the emperor of Rome, and he drove out all of the Jews and all of the Christians because they were keep fighting over who Jesus was and how powerful and if he was a god. And so Emperor Claudius kicked him out. Claudius has died about 4 years ago. And so now the Christians and the Jews are starting to come back into Rome. And now Paul is writing them and saying, I still know it's kind of a weird time, right? Because you still have the soldiers of Claudius who are kicking out and don't want that. And you have people, I really don't know what the new emperor stands for. It's kind of a scary, sketchy time. And so Paul's writing and says, but I want to come for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God. It is the power, the dunamis. That's the word that we get dynamite, right? It is the power. And it's so important to notice this. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. What does he say? Because it is the power of the gospel. The gospel, us sharing Jesus Christ, does not contain the power of God, but the gospel itself is literally the power of God, right? So it's not the words that we say when we're evangelizing, we're telling somebody about Jesus. It's not because it has the power of God. It is the power of God. And that is very, very important, not only for us to understand, but it's very important what Paul is saying, right? I'm coming to give the gift that God has given me to share to all people, because I'm not scared of anybody, because I have the dunamis, I have the power, I have the dynamite of God with me. And notice there, I have the power of God. There's another for, right? So he says, because I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God, and because salvation to everyone who believes. So I'm coming because it is the power, and because it gives salvation to anyone who believes. And that word believe is the continuous form. It means as you're believing. The same in the New Testament as it talks about as we're walking. It is a daily faith. It is a daily movement. It's a daily living in the faith. For everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And we'll see this a lot in Paul's writing. Remember, this is the Jews in Rome. There's Christians in Rome, and there's Jewish Christians in Rome. So we're going to talk about this, and even Sunday morning, we're going to dive more into this idea of Jews versus Gentile and why they're one. But but I've come, salvation has come to what? The Jews first. And it doesn't, when he says that, it's important to know that he's saying, I don't come and bring salvation to the Jews first, right? It's not like he preaches and say, okay, if you're a Jewish person and you want to accept the gospel, please come down first. Okay, now that's everybody. Okay, now is there any Gentiles? When he says that it comes to the Jews first, he's talking about historically, right? God came to the Jewish nation first. That's the Old Testament. The Messiah came to the Jewish nation first and comes through the Jewish nation, and now it is to the Messiahs. So when Paul says it comes to the Jews first and then the Gentiles, Paul will evangelize and lead anybody to Christ, no matter if they're a Jew or Gentile, in what order. He's just historically saying that God came to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. I give you there John chapter 4, Matthew 15, where Jesus was talking about that he came for Israel first. But we see all through the gospel that Gentiles were saved too, right? So we see Gentiles are saved, then a Jew, and it goes back and forth, right? So Gentiles are saved, and he's calling the Pharisees to repentance, right? So we see that. It's a historical statement, not so much a forward statement. So they called to the Jews first, also to the Greeks. For it is in righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. For in it is the righteousness, it's the justice, the judicial approval, right? So in your mind, when you think about this, you get the illustration. If I was to ask you, what does it mean to be right with somebody? How do you know you're right with somebody, right? Something happens, there's a problem, and, Joe calls me a bad name, and it hurts my feelings. He says I have a lot of molecules, and it's really hurt my feelings, and I just, every time I'm around Joe, I'm sad, I'm kind of mad, I can't believe it. And Joe realizes, and he comes to me and says, hey, I know I said you were fat, Pastor. I know I did. But I was just meaning it, as a joke, and it was just this. Man, I'm really sorry. And I'm saying, fine, whatever. But then the next time we're around, I'm still I'm put off by Joe. How does Joe know if he's right with me? Well, when we know that we're right with people, we know that we're okay, right? We have no debts with that person. We have no problems in between us. And so that idea when he says, for in the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, this word righteousness means right standing, right? That you're standing before a judge and everything is okay. You've done nothing wrong. There's no beef between you and the judge. There's no kind of problem. You don't owe him anything. There's no outstanding debts. And so it's important to understand that word righteousness, because in the book of Romans, it's used a whole lot, right? So for in it, the righteousness, the right standing of God is revealed from faith to faith. And we're going to see that word revealed a lot tonight. That's the word apocalypto, which means apocalypse or revelation, means to reveal or an appearing. So the righteousness of God is being revealed, is being appeared from faith, for faith, as it is written. How is the right standing of God appearing? And then it says, well, it's about written. And we see a little quote there. And that quote is from the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4. And I don't know if you know your prophets. I love the minor prophets. Probably one day we're going to do a series through all the minor prophets, because I really love the minor prophets. But Habakkuk is a great book. If you think the news is crazy now, you need to read Habakkuk, right? So Habakkuk, the little backstory, Habakkuk is a prophet to Israel, and the whole time Israel has been bad, right? And so in chapter 1 of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is standing there, and he's kind of doing a joke, right? He starts complaining to God, God, you're not listening to us. You're not doing anything. Why aren't you doing anything? And then God comes to Habakkuk and says, here's what I want you to do, Habakkuk. Start writing. Just start writing. Because I'm going to bring an ungodly nation against Israel, talking about Babylon, and I'm going to destroy all of Israel, including Jerusalem, and they're going to take you off into bondage. And Habakkuk is like, what? What? I didn't want that, God. Whoa, slow your roll. And so God is like, Habakkuk, start writing, and you will see at the very end how you will persevere through all of this. And Habakkuk's like, I don't really want to see at the end, God. I want to know right now. I want to know right now I'm going to be okay. I want to know right now Israel's okay. And God says, it's not for you to know. You are going to be decimated. Israel is going to be decimated, but they will persevere if you have faith. So in chapter 2, verse 4, he says, the righteous will live by faith. The godly of Israel, as Babylon comes and takes them away, the righteous, the godly will live by faith. And then you flip over to Daniel, go back a couple months, right? What happens? The righteous young teenagers get taken away. They stand up for what is God. And what happens, right? The rest is history. Daniel and his righteous friends persevere. And so if you've ever heard of the theological term, perseverance of the saints, if you want to know, hey, how do I know if I die I'm going to heaven? Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, where this comes from, is in a passage that really talks about knowing that God will persevere. God's not going to let you go. He's saying, I have Israel, and people's going to die. They're going to get taken over, but I will sustain them all the way to the end. if they have faith. Right? And so that's kind of the idea. So when Paul's writing here, and he's talking about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because of the power of the gospel, because it brings salvation, and it gives right standing for everybody who lives by faith. He's quoting a little Old Testament to them. And then verse 18, right? Then it just dumps. So if you're really to say, you can take verse 16, 17, and say that's kind of like the theme sentence of the chapter. We will always be coming back to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But now in 18, he moves right on, right? So everything is being revealed. The power of the gospel is being revealed. We can have salvation. We have this. We're to persevere. And then you turn to verse 18, and what's the first word? For. Right? When you see the word for, it's the word because, right? So for, or because of, because we have this, because the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Because, okay, or for, that we go back to verse 17, because for our righteousness is being revealed from faith to faith, because or for the wrath of God is being revealed. The word wrath is the word orge. The word orge there means to be settled or to determine indignation. Kind of this idea that the wrath, it's when somebody says you are guilty and you're going to jail. You know where you're going. That's wrath, right? You have a purpose statement of where you're going. But when we use the word wrath, and this is I don't know if it's very hard. It's very hard for lost people to understand. It's very hard for even young Christians to understand, right? Because when we think of God, we think of butterflies and unicorns and hearts and rainbows, and God is love, and we love those things, but God perfectly loves, but God also perfectly hates. If God only perfectly loved, then he would not be God. He would not be just. He would not be holy. If God could only love you and not hate your sin, not hate anything that was against him, God would be a God of unicorns and butterflies and rainbows and whatever else, right? Just be it doesn't matter. Just come to me. That's okay. You killed that person. I still love you, right? And we can see in every culture, but especially in today's culture, right? We see parents in stores who are parents like that, right? Parents who there's a right and there's a wrong, right? You see parents, like spanking their kid, in the cracker aisle, and you're like, yes. That's a good parent, right? And then you see the other parent who's like, sure, you can have the M&Ms. Yes, baby, we love you. You can do that. And the kid's being a holy terror, right? There's nothing ever wrong with that kid except for everybody in the world hates that kid but the mom, right? You're going to have that idea, right? So we have to understand this idea of wrath, of understanding that wrath is, even though it's a bad thing, it's also a really good thing. It's what makes God God. Because most of us, we're not wrathful people. We don't want bad things to happen. We don't like the idea, and we kind of waver on some things because we want to be more love. But God is perfect, so God perfectly loves. He perfectly hates. And it's kind of a hard, it's a big theological kind of thing to grip your mind around. But I gave you some ideas, right? So when you think about wrath, and a lot of people, especially lost people and young Christians, they think wrath is Old Testament, right? And Jesus is love, that's New Testament. And so that's why we get there's really two gods of the Bible. You'll hear that a lot. You'll hear good Christians even say some things like that, like, oh, well, in between the times, God really, just changed his mind, which is crazy, right? And so what does this mean? We think about wrath. I just gave you a few examples. You have the flood in Genesis chapter 6. You have, he confounded the languages and moved everybody world, the Tower of Babel at chapter 11. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, chapters 18 and 19. He destroyed Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea of Exodus 14. He poured his wrath out on pagan kings, a whole lot of pagan kings. But you have Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. Those are some important ones. Poured out wrath on his own people. King Nadab was a great Christian king, but he didn't listen to God. He even poured them out on Aaron and Miriam, right? Moses' brother and sister. They went up against Moses and said, I don't think that's what God said. And, right? And God was like, that's what I said. I'm sorry, right? They have that, right? Numbers 12. And then we can even see in the New Testament, Jesus is love. Jesus is also wrath. John chapter 3:16, right? We know that for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him have eternal life. And then just a few short verses later, verse 36, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. Right? Oh, Jesus is love. He's also wrath. He has to be both. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 22, Paul writes to Corinth that says, if anyone has no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. Let him be put out. Let him be of the wrath. That's kind of what that word means. So we see that. There's a whole lot of verses of both. That's want to kind of give you a little bit of both. So when we see wrath, when we think wrath, from now until the end of the study of Romans, it is a bad thing, but it is also a needed and holy thing from God. When we have wrath, when you step on a Lego and you start yelling and screaming and yelling at your kids because they left their Legos out, that's not a holy wrath, right? That's a, oh my goodness, I just literally almost killed myself wrath, right? And so, somebody makes a bad decision, there's difference, right? So, for the wrath of God is revealed. There's that word, apocalypto, right? So, it's this appearing, this revelation from heaven. So, the wrath of God, this is so important, right? The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, in the English, we see revealed, so when you see that, it's a past tense. In the Greek, it sticks out really good, and it's saying that it's a super past tense. It's not saying that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. The wrath of God is slowly falling down, and people are seeing it. It's saying that the wrath of God from the beginning of time has been revealed. Every person who ever was, ever is, and ever will be until Jesus comes back has seen the wrath of God. It's not this mysterious thing that nobody knows about. Everybody has seen the wrath of God. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And so those words, ungodliness and unrighteousness, they're synonyms, kind of almost the same word, but you kind of have this idea where that ungodliness is this lack of reverence or devotion, saying, I don't like God. And unrighteousness kind of encompasses that, but it focuses on the results. So kind of to get in your mind, ungodliness is saying, when, your dad told you to do something, right? And you say, no, let's change that. When your mom told you to do something, right? At some point, your mom said, do this. And at some point, growing up, you said, I don't have to do that, right? I don't have to do that. And your mom's like, what'd you say, right? I don't have to do that. You're saying, I don't respect who you are. I don't respect your position. I don't want to. That's ungodliness. I know who you are. I really know what you do. I know your structure and your hierarchy in our house, but I don't have to listen to you. I'm going to go to my friend's house. Now that going to my friend's house is the unrighteousness. The ungodliness is saying, I don't put you in the place that you are. Mom, you are the hierarchy. Dad, you are the hierarchy of this house. But you're not the hierarchy of this house. I'm the hierarchy of this house. That's ungodliness. Unrighteousness is everything you do Because you've taken mom and dad and you've moved them down, right? So dad, mom, dad says, hey, we're going to go here for supper. I want to go to Chick-fil-A. I don't care what you want. Right? So you said you're higher than them. And then whatever you do after that, because now you've placed yourself above them, is the unrighteousness. So ungodliness is saying, God is not God, you are God, we are God, I am God. And then every action that I do, because now God is not above me, I am above God, is all what we would call sin, right? Anything that puts above God. But anything that we do is unrighteous. So it's kind of two words, very similar, but two different kind of ideas. So when Paul is saying this, it says, for the wrath of God, for his kind of determined indignation is revealed from heaven from the very beginning against all ungodliness, is saying God is not God, in all unrighteousness, the actions, because we believe God is not God, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. The word truth is aletheia. This means divine truth. It's saying that this is from God, right? So it's saying, hey, we don't believe this because we are above what God says. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Verse 20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, his divine nature, have clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So when I remember sitting in Boyce, I remember sitting in seminary, I remember sitting in some kind of doctoral classes, and every year that you would always start out a theology class was, if there was a man on an island, on a deserted island, he's never seen anybody, he's never heard anything, it was just him, the palm tree, and his coconuts, and his volleyball named Wilson, right? If that's him, if he died, would he go to hell? And as soon as the professor said that, it was WWF in the classroom. I mean, just you'd have 100 wannabe preachers and they would go at it. I mean, just game on, right? And the reality is, yes, he would go to hell. He would not ask Jesus in his life. But how? How would he know? Nobody gave him a Bible. Nobody shared the gospel with him. That's so unfair. That's so wrong. Right here, this is what Paul is writing about. So he's explaining the gospel and he's saying all the wrath of God has been revealed from heaven against putting yourself above God and all the actions that come from putting yourself above God, because you say you are God over God. You're suppressing the truth. Then he says, for what can be known about God? What the man on the deserted island with the palm tree, the coconuts, and the volleyball named Wilson, what he can know about God is plain to him. He might not have the Bible. He might not know the name Jesus. But that man in his making, in his creation, can look up at the cosmos and every year, every month, every day, see the pattern of stars move across the sky and in a certain order, and then he would see that again. He would see the moon go from full to half to a very sliver to no moon, and then all of a sudden we have a full moon again. We can see the tides come in and he can see the tides come out at the same time of the day. Things that he can witness, things that he can see, can prove that there is something larger and greater and smarter than he is on the island. And because of that, he will and deserves the wrath of God unless he lives by faith. But that's not fair. And that's really fair, right? That's saying this is, you put yourself, because, and we're going to see and give examples of this, people always place things above God, right? And we'll see what he means by that. But he says that it's plain to them. I gave you an important kind of section there in Acts chapter 17. If you remember, Paul is on Mars Hill, and he's debating with some of the most popular Greek philosophers of the day. And while he's on Mars Hill and he's debating with these philosophers, this is what he says. For as I passed along and I observed the objects of your worship. He's walking past an acropolis, right? All the columns, and there's a god of Zeus, and there's a god of this, and a god of that. He's walking past all of these gods, all these statues. And he observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with the inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. So he says, I was walking along and I see a statue to this and this and this. And then there was one that was to nowhere. I don't know, those of you who went to Israel, did you guys go to the beginning of the Jordan River? It's a big wall and the river comes out of the mountain, and there's parts of Acropolis and they have some statues there. Did you guys do that? Okay, super cool. There's a pool, and in this pool in the very back there's a carving of a statue, and that statue is their unknown God. So the people that worship there was to the unknown God. Right next to that, in the wall was a carving out. I have pictures. I should have brought them. And it's the goat. It's Pan. It's Tumnus off Narnia. It's the half goat, half man. And then after that, it was the sacred goat cemetery. And there's a cemetery, super weird, of goats. It's this really weird place. But they there in Israel had not Israelites, but some people, some Moabites that built that there, were there and for a God with no name. So Paul says, I noticed I was walking along and you have all these gods, but you wrote one on the scripture that says, to the unknown God. What therefore do you worship as unknown? The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of the heaven and of the earth, he does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling places, that they should seek God and perhaps feel the way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Paul goes to these philosophers of Mars. He says, I notice you have one that says to any other god, to some unknown god. Paul's like, why do you worship things you've made? This is dumb. Like, you've made that rock. You carved that out. Let me tell you about the real God. He created man, and out of one man he created the nations. He set boundaries. He let people groups move to this far and said no more. He created the earth, and he created rivers, and he created stars. He did all this. He said there's only one God, and you don't need to create anything to serve him. He doesn't need anything from you because he's an actual God. All of these things back here, these are rocks. Like, this doesn't make sense. And so Paul is kind of on this idea of saying that God is plain to them. Even though they've never heard the name of Jesus, even though they may have never read the Torah or the Pentateuch or the Old Testament or the writings of the prophets, they knew something was grander than them, so they started carving out all these rocks, and just to make sure they got it all, they put one over there with no face that said, some other unknown God. Oh, all other, right? Remember on the test, it'd be like, answer A is blah, 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 B, blah, blah, C, blah, D, all the above. And you're like, yes, right? You're just kind of like, I don't know, so it's D, all the above. All right? And so hoping that, it was right? You have that. That's kind of what they did. So Paul is saying, it's plain to everybody that there's a God. You guys who don't know anything, you're worshiping something, but it's something that you've made. It's not something that's above you, right? You've carved it, you've made it. He goes on. For although, once again, because of everything he just said, although they knew God through nature, through the tides, through the stars, through the moons, through the air, right? The things that they can know that there's something greater than them. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. They did not honor, they did not glorify. They did not honor the God. So even though they knew that something was greater than them, They just didn't worship. They didn't just think about a God that was grander than they are. What did they do? They put themselves above that God and they said, oh, I know who that God is. That God is Zeus. And Zeus is the father of all gods. And his son, Hercules, came down, right? So they started making all these other gods. It's not that they were worshiping something that is greater than them. Somebody at some point put themselves above this God that created everything and started developing all these other little gods, all these other idols, all these other stories, all these other philosophies, right? They started creating all this. So although they knew God, they did not glorify God. It's not in your notes, but when you think about that word honor or glorify, the word glory or glorify in Hebrew is the word kehod. And the word kehod means to weight. It means it's literally how much you weigh, how much something weighs. And it's interesting, so when you read in the Old Testament about the glory of God, it's always talking about the weight of God. It's just kind of funny because you're like, man, God's really fat. He's kind of heavy, right? It's kind of interesting. And what's interesting is the idea of how much you weigh, because back then they didn't have coinage, right? The Israelites did not even start using coins until after the captivity, after Babylon. Until they come back, they rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, they start building the city, and then they said, you know what, it'd be really easy if we start thinning off some pieces of gold and silver, and the first thing they created was the shekel. And we see that a lot in the New Testament, right? So it wasn't until almost the end of Israel that they started doing it. They would carry gold and silver, and it would be by the weight, or animals by the weight. So when we use the word honor or glorify God, it's the weight of God. How much does God weigh on your life? That's what your glorification is. That's how much you glorify God. If you can go somewhere, you can do something, and God doesn't weigh down on you, you're not glorifying God, right? It's kind of like Sunday, right? You're sitting in your tree stand, in your bass boat, in your recliner, and you've been doing that for 3 years, but you say God means a whole lot. Well, if you never honor God, that weight of God's not important. You don't feel God. You're not glorifying God. You're not putting God above yourself. And because you're not doing that, that allows you to sit in a bass boat, tree stand, recliner, whatever, right? So it's kind of the idea. It's just an interesting little tidbit. They did not honor him. They did not give God the weight that he needed as God. So they did not honor him. They did not give thanks. They were ungrateful. This God that they really didn't know, they necessarily didn't have a name. They didn't thank this higher being for the stars and the tide and the moon. And they didn't think of all that. What happens? It was all about them. They did everything, right? They did it. And because of that, they become futile in their thinking. They refuse to give God his truth, to allow to guide their hearts and minds, which also allowed them to start filling their minds with what's important, right? It's America, people. Ask people, hey, you go to church on Sunday? No? Well, that's kind of the normal answer you get, right? No, I don't go to church on Sunday. Why don't you? Because they filled their futile minds with anything else. That's the day I golf. That's the day I hunt. That's the day I sleep in. That's the day, fill in the blank, right? That's what they're doing. They're adding things. They're just chasing things. That's the day we have soccer. That's the day our kids go to this. That's that. All of that is becoming what? Weightier than God, right? It's becoming more. They're glorifying everything else and chasing everything because their foolish hearts were darkened, right? Because they didn't honor God, they didn't know God, and so because they didn't glorify God, they didn't honor him, because they didn't give him gratitude, because they were chasing anything other than this God, their foolish hearts were darkened. They were going further and further away from God. They claimed to be wise. They became fools. Just recently, have anybody watched the news and seen a politician claim to know it all and be wise? Right? It's what they do, right? The most lost people claim to know everything. Why does Hollywood have to tell me what the best sex in the world is? They're lost. They don't know. Why do you have to tell me this is the best? This is how you should live. This is how, right? The most lost claim to be the wisest, right? We see it in our own time. It's the same here. It's because it's biblical. It transcends time. They claim to be wise, but they became fools. Do you guys know some politicians and Hollywood stars that are fools? Pretty much all of them, right? All of them, 100% of them, right? They claim to be they claim to be wise, but they became fools because why? Because they exchanged the glory, they exchanged the weight of the immortal God for images, for idols, for things they created, stories they made, philosophies, statues they carved out of stone, resembling mortal man, birds, animals, and creeping things, right? The first thing that happened, right? The Garden of Eden was what? They put themselves above God, right? Adam and Eve said, we don't like you, God. We want to be above you, right? That was it. And for a while, that's what, if you read through the book of Genesis, that's what happens. Every sin, everything that happens, what? They put themselves above God. They put themselves above God. But as you read through history, as you read through the Bible, it's not just them, right? What happens? Moses goes up on the mountain. He gets the 10 commandments, the 10 first laws that says this is how you're going to show the world that you are given to the God. Number 1, do not create idols. Put no one in front of God. And Moses comes down, all white-haired, beaming. You guys won't believe what God said. God said, don't make. What in the world is that golden cow for? I mean, they couldn't wait, right? And now it went from idolizing men and women, and then it was cows, and then it was that, and then it was birds, which the only reason it puts birds in there, just let me know, Rome loved birds. You know, eagles was awesome. And they also love, not storks, but what's the big long-legged birds, like around water? Like, what are those called? Herons? Is that what they're called? What is it? What? Crane! Yeah, but it's not a crane. It's something else. But it's like, okay, let's call it a heron. I think it's a heron. But anyways, it's a weird bird. They idolized it, right? You think about Egypt, right? They had falcons, right? That was their big thing. You see anything? It's a falcon, right? And so it happens, right? And then after that, you keep reading through history. What happens? They come across some civilizations. You have the Canaanites, you have the Hittites, and what do they start worshiping? They're like, hey, these snakes are really cool. Let's put that, you know? What? They're creepy, right? That's so weird. And I have 2 in my house, right? They are creepy. I'm going to tell you that, right? And so they go from humans to 4-legged to birds. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse, right? And now people idolize everything. I gave you there a passage of Isaiah chapter 44, and that's just them talking about, it's a great passage. I encourage you to read it. I'm just going to skip it for time. But it's really Isaiah because Israel went through a time where they were doing more idol worship, right? In Isaiah, it's literally in chapter 44, he just totally makes fun of them. It's a great passage. And he's like, okay, so you chop down a tree with an axe that's been made by man, right? You chop down a tree and then you burn it. And you burn it to the ashes. And over those ashes, you eat some food, right? And then out of that food, you pick out a seed. And then that seed, you put it in the ground. And then it gets watered. And then the tree grows. And then you cut something out of that tree with the axe that you made that time ago. And you melt some metal over the fire that you do with that tree. And then you make something, this big metal statue. And you say, wow, that's really holy. And Isaiah's like, what? Dude, you ate over it? This is dumb. It doesn't make sense. It's a great passage just talking about idols that I'll skip. I just kind of summarized it, but I encourage you. If you haven't read it, it's funny. And then you get verse 24. Therefore, right? There's the word. It's just like for, right? Because of everything I just said, because of everything that happens, because they did not know God, because they did not honor God, because they were not grateful to God, because they gave up their minds to chase worldly things, their hearts were darkened because they were starting to chase idol, because all of that, therefore, because God gave them up. This is the idea of somebody sinning to sentence. We see Paul use this word 3 other times. And the other 3 times that Paul uses this word is in Galatians and 2 in Ephesians. And it talks about when Jesus gave up his body. to be killed on the cross, right? He gave them up. So we get this idea that it was this kind of judicial sense of giving it up over. God gave them up in their lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. So the word lust there, it's important. I always, like when I taught students, this is kind of how I explain lust to students, right? I think it's a great idea. The word lust means simply to over-desire, right? It's good for a man to like a woman, right? It is not good for a man to over-desire a woman, right? To think about her day and night, to console her, to stalk her, to look in her window, to take pictures at her when she's looking, to breathe all heavy in her hair and smell it on the school bus. That's weird, right? That's an over-desire. Over-desire is bad, right? We all have a desire. To go over and beyond is sometimes a bad thing, right? So the word lust, he gave them over to their lust, to their over-desires of their hearts. Now, what was on their hearts? The next word, impurity, right? Uncleanliness. It's the idea, when we use this word, it means to be in the grave, decay. It means a body rotting away. And so he's saying that he gave them away because they did not worship God, because they were not grateful, because they made up their new gods. He gave them over to the over-desires of their hearts that were full of death. It was full over nastiness, over decay, over gross. 2, he gave them over to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves because, he's going kind of back again, because what do? They exchanged the truth for God, that this being that was powerful to me, that created everything. And once again, right, they don't know who it is, right? We're still talking about the man on the island. Because of this, but instead of worshiping a God that is greater than them, that they don't even really understand and they just know, instead what happened? They lied to themselves and they put themselves above the God and they started fashioning their own gods. And so because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever and ever. When we talk about law, lost people suppress the very existence of God, right? We know that, right? You watch the news, watch the TV, right? Talk to anybody in the world, right? You go to a science class at Northside High School, right? You go to every science teacher there in the middle of class, not across the kitchen table, right? In the middle of their class, and you say, tell me exactly how the world was created. What are they going to say? They're not going to say, well, God created. They're not going to say that. It's because they can't say that, right? They're going to have to say what? The world suppresses lies, right? The world does everything they can do to take God out, right? And so it just happens, right? So you have this, that they were, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and he worshiped and he served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever and amen. That idea, who is blessed forever and amen, it's just kind of a nice little kind of common doxology. You kind of get in Paul's mind, and he's sitting and he's writing about all this wrong and all this wrath, and why people would just kind of disobey God and just go against God and not be grateful for God. And then it's kind of him just saying, the Creator is blessed forever. It's kind of his just like, get all these nasty thoughts out of my mind. I can't believe this, right? And so then verse 26, for this reason, once again, because everything we said before, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. All right. Now, before we start here, let me say this, and I'm sure everybody in this room's heard this, right? You'll hear a lot of times the next couple verses that we're about to go through. People will say it was a threefold thing, right? A good Southern Baptist will say, "Well, here's 3 points I'm about to give you," right? He gave them over to homosexuality. He gave their mind away, and he let them go, right? And so I'm going to say, it's not quite biblical, right? It's not like he gave them away this and then 2 and then 3. He's giving different examples of what's going on, right? So it's not that he made them into homosexuality. He allowed them to be homosexuals. Then we did this. He gave over their minds. And then he did this. It's just saying because they exchanged the truth for a lie, God gave them up. When it says he gave them up, it means that he took his hand of protection off, right? We see this all the time with Israel. We see it all the time with us today. Hello, right? There's times where if there's people, even Christians, if you're not living a godly life, God will sometimes remove his hand to get you that whooping, that spanking, that oh my goodness, right? Get you up, pay attention. Oh, okay. And then he comes back over. But for lost people that never knew him, God is a grace, right? Grace reigns on the just and the unjust, right? Rain falls on the just and the unjust. So you can have this, right? So here, God gave them over to their dishonorable passions. So when you use this word passions, of course, it's a sexual word. Sexual passions or lust or over-desire for sex. And then we go, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And that the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving themselves the due penalty for their error. Now I will say, I know homosexuality is a big issue in today's world. This is the longest passage in the Bible about homosexuality, right? This is it, right? So it's it. So there's a whole lot of good stuff on this one, right? You watch YouTube, you're going to get a million different answers on what this passage means, right? So let me kind of walk this through. What's interesting about this passage is it talks about what? For women exchange. It starts with women. And it's very interesting that it starts with women because women, through history, okay, even in America, right? Even in America, but women in most cultures they're more reluctant than men. They're not as kind of promiscuous, right? They don't go into that way. They're less likely to be involved in sexual kind of misencounters than guys. And so Paul says women up front because it's kind of the idea that the women are the last to go, right? So you can have a civilization and men are in this over-desire for sex and even homosexual sex. But he starts off with the women, right? The women gave up right, women being with men. He gave them up so that women are with women. It's kind of showing and telling the idea that the readers of that world would be, if they knew a city that was like that, they'd be like, "Ooh, that's long gone." And it's important to understand Rome was a huge homosexual sinner, okay? The first 14 out of 15 Caesars or emperors of Rome practiced open homosexuality, right? So the first 14 out of 15 in Rome. So for Paul to write this, and in all of his travels around the world, it was normal. And I know even today, you'll hear people say, well, this doesn't apply because this is talking about homosexual promiscuity, right? This is talking about lots of lovers and people bouncing off. But what if it was one man in a marriage for a long time, or a woman in a marriage for a long time? Paul's seen that. America, we didn't make that. That's not new, right? America at one point made it legal so you could get health insurance. But men with men have been in relationships for a long time in history. Rome would have been full of them. When you get into Galatia, you get up to the northern part of Turkey, it was very popular. Rome was taking over. This is not something that, well, they don't understand today in 2000. They got it, right? It's hard to believe. Rome has it way worse than America has it, right? Because when you're Caesar, when you're God, basically, right? Because the first person you worshipped in Rome is who? The Caesar, right? So when your God is an open homosexual, how does anybody say it's not? It would be as if every day you would watch our president commit homosexual acts on TV, and then you trying to educate your child that that's wrong. That'd be almost impossible. The guy in the office that's appointed, that's the highest, the person of the world, says it's okay. Look, he's practicing, Mom. You can see it. You can do it. And you're just like, I know, honey, but that's not what God wanted. That's a hard sell, right? That's a really hard sell. So when we get into this, when he says woman, he's using women because women are last. Almost, you would always see guy homosexuality, but for a woman to practice it, it'd be kind of in. And then also to talk about women, just real quick, you would have the word woman there, right? So the woman there is the word thalus. Thalus. And the word thalus means female. Okay, this is kind of an important part. So it says female. The other word that would mean woman, if you're reading through the Greek and you read it, is the word gune. And that's the word that we would translate woman, right? When he says to Martha, woman, gune, right? Woman. And the difference that it's making is if you look down to the next verse and it says, and the men likewise. The word men there is the word arhev. And the word arhev means male, right? In the Greek, the word for men is men. Okay? You guys know a Greek word, right? Men is men. Men means men, but arhev means male. And it's very interesting because he's writing and he's saying what happens is kind of in our language today, we would use the word, lady and a gentleman, right? How you doing today? Oh, he's such a gentleman. It comes with a certain kind of class, a certain kind of, they're kind of nice. They're dignified, right? But when Paul's writing this, he uses like what we would call today the biological word. When he says, for females, not women, not ladies, females exchange their natural relations for those that are contrary, and the males, not the gentlemen, right, but the males likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving themselves the due penalty of the error. So they were consumed. That word means to be inflamed. And I put you down there some quotes, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But when you think about and you read about homosexuality, and even in today's time, I kind of gave you some things. And if you have questions, I can point you to the books that I pull them from. I didn't put all all the biographical information. But when it comes to homosexuality, when you think about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Here was men that were so over desire. They were so much in their lust that they didn't even realize that God made them blind, and they're clawing and trying to find the door to get in the house. Today, and this is kind of in your notes, you talk about forensic experts. There's a book. It's not that I was reading. I was looking, and so I wouldn't read these kind of books. I'm not into forensic science, not in those movies. But the forensic. Who's the guy that's called when you die? Coroner. There we go. So yeah, thank you. There you go. The forensic coroner, when he comes in, and it's a book written by the forensic coroner of San Francisco and New York City. And they say in this book, as you're reading through, it's kind of like a chapter. It's not a book. We'll call it a pamphlet. As they're reading through, they talk about that within 3 seconds, they can tell that the man on the table, if he's gay or not, if he's homosexual. And the reason that they can tell is because of the brutality, I'm quoting here, from the brutality and the wounds and the mutilations. And what they go on to talk about is, in one of these, the guy from San Francisco is a homosexual himself, and he goes on to say that anybody who wants to get homosexuality needs to make sure, because in the homosexual community, they are so driven that when somebody cheats or when somebody gets angry, when they get in a fight, they can tell if they're gay, not just from their sexual mutilations, but by the death. He said, you can have somebody off of a street that's shot in the head once. But if it was a homosexual couple that got in a fight, this guy would be stabbed 20, 30, 40, 50 times. He said, I've seen it. I see it every day, every single day, multiple times a day. And he's talking about, of course, he's not a Christian, but he's talking about in the homosexual community, there's a drive, there's a over-desire, there's a lust that they want to keep on and keep everything that's around them. And in this, it was 3 years old, so I didn't give you the ultimate. But I said over. 3 years ago, the common male homosexual has over 150 partners a year in the United States and in Northern Europe. the over desire, right? The lust, right? It's giving that. And so I'm not necessarily picking on them. I'm not saying it's the ultimate damnation, because it's not. We see in 1 Corinthians that they can still come to Jesus and Jesus will change their heart. We see that. But what we're talking about is this idea of wrath in their living. And Paul's pointing out, and he says, for this reason, he's using this as an example. For this reason, when I gave them over to their own desires, that they went crazy. Like, our own desires will lead us to wanting and going further and further and further. And that's what they did. Men committing shameless acts with men receiving themselves in due penalty for their error. All right, next week we'll finish up the rest. And I'll toss some more in there because they kind of go together. And then we'll move into chapter 2. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you.